Okay, I guess we'll start now. So first of all, welcome to this webinar, Everything You Need to Know About Whiskey Investment. I'm your host, Freeman, and I'm the whiskey specialist for Rare Finds Worldwide. We are a whiskey broker. We mostly work with private customers to help them build their personal collection of whiskey casks for investment purposes. So this whiskey investment webinar will be mostly focusing around on whiskey casks, not so much about bottles, and we'll illustrate also why cask is generally a better investment than when compared to investing in bottles of rare whiskey. And we'll also talk about a little bit of fundamentals, what exactly is Scotch whisky, the market environment, but then most of the time we'll be diving deep into things that you should pay attention to if you consider investing into a whiskey cask. So without further ado, let us begin. So what exactly is Scotch whisky? The Scotch whisky is actually a distilled grain or malt spirit that has been aged in oak cask for at least 3 years. So the Scotch Whisky Association actually categorizes Scotch whisky into 5 different categories, but today we're mostly going to be focusing on single malt whiskey. This is because when people talk about investing in whiskey, when people talk about buying a cask of whiskey, they're always referring to single cask. So no one's referring to blended whiskey, no one's referring to grain whiskeys. Mostly because blended whiskey is basically a homogeneously blended product appealing to the mass consumption market. It's not collectible, it's not a good investment, it just doesn't really go up in value and doesn't have that uniqueness single malt whiskey has. Single malt meaning that, by single meaning that it comes from only one single distillery, and malt whiskey meaning that it comes from 100% malt spirit distilled in a copper pot still. So because each and every distillery has their own unique method of making whiskey, they have their own unique heritage. Therefore, each and every brand of single malt whiskey has its unique style, making it collectible, making it being appreciated by connoisseurs around the world, and hence leading to appreciation in price. So that's why when people talk about collecting Scotch whisky, they're always talking about collecting single malt Scotch whisky. So how is single malt actually made? So the raw material of Scotch whisky is, of course, barley. And so for the first step is obviously harvesting the barley from the farm. It then goes through a process of malting, turning barley into malt, and it is grinded into smaller, finer pieces through milling, and then it's steeped in hot water through a process called mashing. It is then brought to yeast. Yeast is added into the sugary water for fermentation. It is then go through a double distillation process to increase the alcohol content, and then being filled into oak casks for maturation. After a minimum of 3 years, it can then be bottled and be consumed as single malt Scotch whisky. So when people talk about investing, they're either buying it in the form of a cask or buying whiskey in the form of a bottle. So the difference is that buying bottles is generally a much more speculative approach. It also experiences much more price fluctuation. It's a much more fast-paced market with a lot more choices. So it requires a lot more study. And of course, if you are able to spot the next hyped bottle, you will be able to gain a tremendous value within a very short period of time. However, when there are winners, there are also losers. Some bottles don't really increase in value. If you bet in the wrong bottle, you might end up just having to drink your own bottle. However, when we're talking about casks, whiskey casks generally are much more rigid in price. They go up a 15 to 20% very consistently year to year for the past 10 years. And also there's the factor of maturation being involved, making it a much more safe investment overall. So when we talk about maturation in a cask, unlike wine, whiskey doesn't age in the bottle, right? So the age statement you see being slapped onto the bottle, it refers to the time that the whiskey has spent in the oak cask. So meaning that when you hold on to a cask that you own, every single year, every time spent, the legal age of the cask Hence, eventually, the number on the label will be larger and larger every single year. That is where the real value comes from. So on average, each and every single digit added onto the age statement, the whiskey is worth roughly around 15% more. That's just how the market prices whiskey. There's also a natural scarcity caused by physical limitations of aging. So you cannot age a cask indefinitely because there is a natural evaporation of the alcohol content as well as the volume of the whiskey itself. So each and every year you lose roughly around 0.5%. So on average, a cask reaching 30 or 40 years old is very, very rare. Most of them will be bottled when it reaches 12, 18 years old, because that's what most consumers would consume and buy to drink. So naturally, only a very small amount of percentage of casks existing in the market are left to be aged beyond 25, 30, or 40 years old, making old aged casks exponentially rare in the market, hence leading to an exponential increase in value. So you can observe in the market a 40-year-old whiskey is not twice the price of a 20-year-old. It's 10 times the price of a 20-year-old due to this exponential rare and scarcity of old aged casks. Of course, there's also popular ages in the market once whiskeys reach the age of, let's say, 20, 25, 30, 35, they see significant increase in age, making these with the ideal time and ideal moments for investors to actually sell their whiskey. So historically speaking, the cask value appreciation per year is roughly around 15%. So in Rare Vines Worldwide, we tend to target only the premium casks, only casks from good distilleries that are globally recognized, top distilleries in Scotland, and they generally do perform 20, 25, or even some of them hit 30% per year. So it's also worth noting that whiskeys are generally seen as a risk haven by high net worth individuals and investors. Even during the 2008 financial crisis, whiskey market hasn't seen any sign of dropping at all. And even during last year, when the pandemic first broke out during February, whiskey auction prices in April, May, and June basically still see record high, and it's been ever increasing. It's interesting to note that despite the fact that most whiskey consumption in the general public market, in the general market of low-end whiskey has dropped, the auction prices of high-end, truly collectible whiskeys being observed in auctions has increased by 25% in 2020, which is a record-breaking increase in the history of Scotch whisky, which is something very impressive and something very worth taking note of. Meaning that despite the fact that consumer level whiskey has seen drop in exports, whiskey prices has reached record high. So in order to invest in whiskey, of course, we want to understand where these whiskeys come from. So the basic production unit of these whiskeys is, of course, the distilleries that distill these spirits. However, the spirits being distilled today are not being released into the market until 10 or 12 years later, because they're being distilled as new mixed spirits today, being filled into an old cask today, and they do not see the market until they reach a certain age of maturity. So therefore, distilleries would often distill much more spirits than they sell each year, and they would sell these casks to independent bottlers and private investors and institutional investors. So these independent bottlers are companies that do not own distilleries, they do not distill their own spirits, but they will buy casks and release whiskeys under their own brand name. These independent bottlers would again then sell these casks to other interested investors, private individuals, people who want to own their casks of whiskeys. And these casks in general that have left the distilleries circulating in the secondary market are where most individuals operate in, and which is where we also operate in, the secondary cask market, where people are freely trade casks as commodity, as an investment, and as private bottling opportunities. So in order to be able to value a cask, we have to make very clear distinction between official bottlings and independent bottlings. Every single cask you buy are basically independent bottles, independent casks. Therefore, it's very important to compare prices of independent bottlers in the market. It's also very important to distinguish between batch whiskey and single cask whiskies. So every single cask that you buy in the secondary market, eventually they are going to end up as single cask release. So these single cask whiskies, because they only yield as much as the cask contains, therefore they are generally much more rare. As opposed to batch whiskies are bottles of whiskies that are being made by blending hundreds and hundreds of casks together and then being bottled. So they are meant to create a homogeneous and mass production goods. Therefore, generally speaking, the price is much lower as opposed to single cask releases. Therefore, when you compare prices of bottles with casks, you have to find bottles that are independent bottles and also single cask releases. So this is a model that we generally use to find a cask for the right buyer. It's called the DCI model, which categorizes cask buyers into drinkers, investors, and collectors. So obviously, drinkers would care more about the value that they're getting. They care about the taste. They care less about the brand name and care less about the age, as long as it tastes good. Collectors, obviously, they would look for rare items. They would look for old-aged whiskies, and they would look for things that are catchy and have novelty value. Whereas investors would be looking into casks that come from iconic distilleries that have a high ABV, allowing them to age for a longer time, generating more value, and also casks that are good value in general. However, what generally we would not recommend any people to buy are cheap young casks from unknown distilleries. This is because in the recent 5 to 10 years, there has been a lot of new distilleries popping up in Scotland due to popularity of Scotch. These distilleries are all selling casks at 0 to 3 years old, generally not old enough to be called whiskies yet, but are incredibly cheap. So these whiskies could still be quite good. However, they have no proven track record to prove their value. So generally, we only advise investors to stick to distilleries that are globally recognized. So of course, there are a lot of factors affecting the price of cask. First and most important factor being the distillery. The distillery tells you about the spirit quality, the brand name, the history, the fame. So it's basically the face of the cask, and it affects the price a lot. So always stick to famous distilleries and you should be fine. The age of the cask, of course, is the second most important factor determining the price of the cask. And older always means higher price, very simple. The next important factor is the cask type. Sherry would generally be more expensive than its bourbon counterpart, given the same age, same distillery. There are also some less than 1% of the casks are being used, wine, rum, and beer, cognac casks, these other quirky options. Even though they are incredibly rare, generally speaking, because they are not the common industry standard, they do not yield higher value, but sometimes there is a novelty value of it, so you still consider them as a good investment. Vintage is generally not as important to whiskey as it is to wine. We only focus on the age, but not as much on the vintage. The ABV level would then determine the aging potential of the cask. So if you want to age a cask for a long time, you have to find a cask with a high ABV. And if you are looking for a quick sell, then you can possibly find a cask with a lower ABV. So this is what a cask offer generally looks like. You've got the Bowmore here, which is the name of the distillery. The vintage is 1995, for example. The cask type, a first fill sherry hogshead. First fill meaning that the cask is being filled for the first time. Sherry is the type of cask, and hogshead is the shape of the cask. The ABV level means the ABV level, as it states. The RLA refers to the regauged liters of alcohol, meaning the pure alcohol being stated in terms of liters. So the estimated bottles tells you about how much volume the cask holds in terms of 700 milliliters bottles. And then you've got the per bottle average per bottle price and the cask price listed down to the low. So of course, casks come in different shapes and sizes. You've got tiny casks like blood pub, octave, and quarter casks. These are generally not very good investments because they cannot be aged for a very long time. They are being made for the sake of faster aging, hence they're not ideal for long-term aging. So you've got American Standard Barrel and hogsheads, which are the common standards of the industry, and you've got larger casks like the pot pipe, the sherry butt, and the sherry puncheon. So if you're interested in buying a cask, obviously we will work with you to establish your investment goals. How much budget do you have? What's the time frame you aim to hold a cask for? We will then find you the type of cask that is suitable for you, and you only build your collection, build your cask portfolio as we work with you hand in hand, guiding you through the process. Once it's time to sell, we would obviously advise you the right channel, the right price to sell. We have various exit options for you to choose from. Of course, ideally, we want you to sell it through our brokerage, but if you want, you can take it to an auction, you can do it through a private sale. That is not a problem. Again, almost of the casks that in the market are performing 15% per year, but a lot of casks that we do target a little bit higher than that, maybe 20, maybe even 25%, because we do tend to work with premium options. Once you've bought a cask, all the casks will be stored in third-party bonded warehouses with a bottling plant. So if you want to bottle your cask, you can most certainly do that. You can draw a sample for your cask, you can visit your cask, you can re-rack your cask, the content of your cask into other types of cask. Some people would put bourbon cask transfer it into a sherry cask for better value. It's very common nowadays, and it generally does work. And we also recommend you doing an annual regauge just to keep track of the content of your cask. For the first 3 years you buy from us, the storage costs and insurance costs would be covered by Rare Finds worldwide. After the 3 years, it's £65 per cask per year, so it's a very, very minimum cost. So that's pretty much all for today. Once again, thank you very much for your participation. We will be in touch with you just to gauge your interest in whiskey, hoping to find out a little bit more about yourself and give you guys a proper introduction. Otherwise, hope to see you guys again and speak soon. Thank you very much.